Hey, this is Bunny. Today we're talking about one of the most fascinating families of dragons ever created for Dungeons and Dragons, and honestly, one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. While I'm painting this green lung dragon miniature in the background, we're going to wander through decades of D&D history, explore a whole family of dragons that most players have never even met, and wonder why these incredible creatures ended up earning a place in my Gentle and the Wild collection. If your experience with dragons mostly involves giant piles of treasure, dramatic speeches about ruling the world, and setting villages on fire because someone looked at them funny, you're about to discover that dragons can be something very different indeed. Most players encounter dragons through the classic groups. There are chromatic dragons, who generally have the interpersonal skills of an angry chainsaw, and the metallic dragons, who tend to be noble, wise, and just a little bit smug about it. Later editions added the gem dragons, who brought psychic powers and a wonderfully alien perspective to the family. Then, hiding quietly off to the side, very, very quietly, are the lung dragons. They aren't a forgotten mistake or an obscure footnote. They're an entirely different version of what dragons can be. They're mystical, philosophical, deeply connected to nature, and often more interested in harmony than conquest. If chromatic dragons are action movies and metallic dragons are medieval epics, lung dragons are the quiet fantasy novel where everyone keeps pausing to admire the scenery, and somehow that's exactly what makes it wonderful. One of the first things you'll notice about lung dragons is that they don't even look like the dragons many D&D players imagine. Instead of the bulky winged bodies that dominate fantasy art, lung dragons are long and serpentine, with graceful bodies that seem almost to swim through the air. They have 4 legs, flowing whiskers, impressive horns, and surprisingly expressive faces. Many official illustrations don't give them wings at all, yet they fly effortlessly through magic. That's one of my favorite little details. Somewhere, a red dragon is probably having an existential crisis because it spent centuries evolving magnificent wings, only to watch a lung dragon casually float overhead like gravity simply forgot to file the paperwork. The visual inspiration comes primarily from Chinese dragon traditions, and that's important to mention because D&D isn't trying to say these dragons literally are creatures from Chinese mythology. Instead, the designers borrowed artistic themes, symbolism, and ideas to create a completely distinct family of true dragons within the game. They're inspired by those myths, but not copied from them. That distinction matters because once they enter D&D, lung dragons become part of the game's own cosmology. They have their own histories, personalities, magical abilities, and roles in the world that they inhabit. It's a wonderful example of fantasy drawing inspired from real-world traditions, while still becoming something uniquely its own. The history of lung dragons in Dungeons and Dragons actually stretches back farther than many people realize. They first appeared during the early years of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, at a time when the game was rapidly expanding beyond its original inspirations. Designers were experimenting with new settings, new cultures, and new interpretations of classic fantasy creatures. Dragons already existed, of course, but someone looked at the existing dragon families and apparently said, "These are excellent. But what if the dragon wanted to discuss philosophy before vaporizing everyone?" Thus began one of the most interesting additions to D&D's enormous bestiary. The earliest versions referred to them collectively as Oriental dragons, reflecting the terminology that was commonly used in tabletop gaming at the time. Modern editions and modern discussions generally use the name lung dragon instead, both because it is more specific and because it avoids lumping together an enormous range of cultures under a single outdated label. You'll often see older books use the original terminology, while newer conversations almost always say lung dragons. If you're digging through older sourcebooks for inspiration, don't be surprised when you encounter both names. They're talking about the same remarkable family of dragons, just through the lens of different publishing eras. One thing I really appreciate about lung dragons is that they don't simply swap European aesthetics for East Asian aesthetics and call it a day. Their entire worldview changes. Chromatic dragons often see themselves as rulers. Metallic dragons often see themselves as protectors. Lung dragons frequently see themselves as caretakers of balance. Their concerns are larger than individual kingdoms, and sometimes even larger than individual lifetimes. They care about rivers continuing to flow, storms arriving when they're supposed to, mountains remaining sacred, and civilizations learning to live alongside nature instead of constantly trying to dominate it. They're thinking in centuries while everyone else is busy arguing about next Tuesday. That difference in philosophy makes them feel genuinely unique. If a greedy king chops down an ancient forest, a chromatic dragon might ignore it unless the king stole from its treasure hoard. A metallic dragon might intervene because innocent people are being harmed. A lung dragon might intervene because the destruction of that forest throws an entire region out of harmony, affecting animals, rivers, weather patterns, and generations yet to come. They're looking at the whole ecosystem. Honestly, they would probably be exhausting to argue with because they're almost always thinking 500 years ahead. Meanwhile, I'm over here wondering whether I remembered to rinse my paintbrush. Spoiler alert, I didn't. Another wonderful aspect of lung dragons is that they don't necessarily seek fame or recognition. In fact, many stories describe them as disguising themselves as ordinary people. A wandering monk, an elderly fisherman, a quiet scholar, a gardener tending flowers outside a village. Any of these could secretly be an ancient dragon observing the world. They aren't always testing people because they're suspicious. Sometimes they're simply curious. They want to understand how ordinary lives unfold. There's something incredibly charming about imagining an immortal dragon spending 3 months pretending to run a tiny tea shop just because it wanted to hear everyone's gossip. Frankly, that sounds like excellent entertainment. Knowledge means far more to many lung dragons than wealth ever could. That's another major departure from the dragons most players expect. Of course, they may possess treasure, but that treasure often reflects wisdom rather than greed. Ancient scrolls, beautiful works of art, rare musical instruments, poetry, historical records, carved jade, or maybe priceless calligraphy might fill their sanctuaries instead of mountains of gold coins. Imagine finally locating a legendary dragon's lair after months of dangerous travel, expecting glittering riches, only to discover what is essentially the world's oldest, most beautifully organized library. Somewhere, a rogue is quietly trying to figure out how to fence 3,000 years of philosophical essays. Unsuccessfully, most likely. Because wisdom is so central to their identity, conversations with lung dragons often become adventures all by themselves. These are dragons that ask questions instead of delivering speeches. They'll happily challenge assumptions, encourage reflection, and occasionally answer one question with 3 more questions. Adventurers expecting a quick yes or no answer may instead receive an hour-long discussion about personal responsibility, seasonal migration patterns, and whether patience is a form of courage. It's basically fantasy graduate school, except your professor can casually fly away if your essay disappoints them. Attendance is technically optional, but disappointing the dragon seems like an exceptionally poor career move. All of these qualities explain why lung dragons immediately felt at home when I started organizing monsters into emotional themes instead of categories. The gentle in the wild isn't about creatures that are harmless. It isn't even about creatures that are always friendly. It's about beings that embody the untamed beauty of the natural world. Lung dragons fit that idea almost perfectly. They're undeniably wild. They command storms, rivers, mountains, and seas. Yet they're thoughtful, restrained, and often compassionate. They remind us that enormous power doesn't automatically have to lead to destruction. Sometimes it leads to wisdom. Sometimes it leads to stewardship. And occasionally it leads to an ancient dragon patiently explaining why everyone should stop arguing and go plant more trees instead. The really fun part is that lung dragon isn't actually one dragon. It's an entire family made up of several distinct species, each tied to a different aspect of the natural or spiritual world. If you're familiar with chromatic dragons, you may already know that a red dragon and a white dragon have very different personalities and habits. Lung dragons take that idea even further. Their identities aren't simply based on color or breath weapon. Instead, they're connected to concepts like rivers, seas, storms, mountains, spirits, heaven, and even transformation. That gives each variety its own personality and purpose. almost like each one has been assigned responsibility for a different chapter in the world's owner's manual. Let's start with the Li Lung, sometimes called the Earth Dragon. If there were an award for dragon most likely to help your village without asking for credit, the Li Lung would probably win every year. These dragons are closely associated with fertile land, mountains, valleys, and agriculture. They're patient, practical, and surprisingly approachable by dragon standards. If a farming community treats the land with respect, a Li Lung may quietly encourage abundant harvests or protect the surrounding countryside. If that same community starts strip mining mountainsides, poisoning streams, and treating nature like a disposable napkin, well, suddenly everyone discovers that mountains can become remarkably persuasive when a dragon gets involved. Next comes the Lung Wang, the sea dragon, and these are probably the most famous members of the family because they're inspired by the dragon kings of Chinese folklore. In D&D, they're magnificent rulers of oceans, coastlines, tides, and the deep waters. Sailors who respect the sea may receive calm weather and safe passage. Sailors who decide the ocean is their personal garbage can may discover that hurricanes are surprisingly motivational. I appreciate that these dragons aren't petty. They aren't sitting offshore waiting for someone to sneeze in the wrong direction. But they do expect respect for the waters they protect. And honestly, considering how terrifying the open ocean already is, I don't think antagonizing the dragon in charge of it is a particularly well-developed business strategy. Then we have the Chiang Lung, the river dragon. Rivers are fascinating because they're constantly changing while somehow remaining the same river, and that fluid nature fits these dragons perfectly. A Chiang Lung might watch over an entire watershed for centuries, ensuring that floods come when they're needed. Droughts don't linger longer than they should, and the countless communities along the river understand that fresh water isn't an unlimited resource. If you've ever looked at a river and thought, "This seems peaceful," congratulations! Somewhere nearby there's probably a dragon making sure it stays that way. Or at least that's the sort of thing a Chiang Lung would probably like you to believe. One of the more intimidating members of the family is the Tun Mi Lung, sometimes called the Typhoon Dragon. These dragons embody violent storms, cyclones, and the overwhelming force of nature. Now, it's tempting to hear Typhoon Dragon and immediately assume they're evil. That's actually missing the point. A typhoon isn't evil. It doesn't wake up one morning, twirl its imaginary mustache, and ask itself how many villages it can inconvenience before lunch. It's simply one of nature's tremendous forces. Tun Mi Lung dragons represent that same idea. They remind us that nature can be beautiful, nurturing, terrifying, and destructive all at the same time, often without assigning any moral judgments to the process. Now, if the Tun Mi Lung dragon represents nature at its loudest, the Pan Lung represents nature at its quietest. These are often called coiled dragons, and they're wonderfully mysterious creatures. Legends frequently describe them sleeping or meditating for incredibly long periods, sometimes decades at a time. Imagine explaining to your friends, "Sorry I missed game night. I accidentally took a 40-year nap." Panlung dragons are associated with mountains, contemplation, and hidden wisdom. They aren't lazy. They're simply operating on a timescale where 40 years feels roughly equivalent to someone else's weekend. When they do awaken, it's usually because something important has shifted in the balance of the world. And now we arrive at one of my personal favorites, the Shen Lung, or spirit dragon. These dragons blur the line between physical and spiritual. They're often associated with mist, dreams, ancestors, sacred places, and unseen realms. If you want to tell a ghost story in a D&D setting without making it outright horror, a Shen Lung could easily become part of that narrative. They're mysterious without being frightening. They might appear during moments of profound personal change, offer guidance through symbolic visions, or simply watch over sacred places that most people don't even realize are sacred. They're the sort of dragon that leaves adventurers wondering afterward whether they actually met a dragon at all. Standing near the top of the family are the Tang Lung, the celestial dragons. These are perhaps the closest lung dragons come to being divine figures. They aren't gods in the traditional D&D sense, but they're deeply connected to heaven the cosmic order, destiny, and celestial authority. They rarely involve themselves in everyday mortal concerns because they're focused on the much larger patterns unfolding across the world. If a Chiang Lung shows up personally, chances are something incredibly significant is happening. Either history is about to change forever, or somebody accidentally knocked over the cosmic filing cabinet. Both situations probably require immediate attention. Finally, we have the Yu Lung, often referred to as the carp dragon, and these are absolutely delightful from a storytelling perspective. They're inspired by the famous East Asian legend of the carp that swims upstream, leaps the dragon gate, and transforms into a dragon through perseverance. That's such a beautiful image that D&D wisely borrowed the concept. Yu Lung dragons symbolize growth, determination, and transformation. Young Yu Lung are often portrayed as curious, energetic, and even playful before gradually maturing into wise and respected dragons. It's one of the few dragon stories where personal growth isn't just metaphorical. It literally turns into a dragon. That's setting the bar for self-improvement just a little bit high for us. One thing I enjoy about this entire family is that none of these dragons feel interchangeable. You couldn't simply repaint a miniature blue and declare it a different lung dragon. Their identities come from the connection to the world around them. A sea dragon isn't just an earth dragon that enjoys vacations at the beach. Their entire worldview changes because of what they represent. That gives dungeon masters enormous storytelling opportunities. Players aren't just meeting another dragon. They're meeting an embodiment of a particular natural force, and that naturally shapes every conversation, every decision, and every adventure that follows. Lung dragons also interact with mortals differently than many other dragons. They often teach rather than command. They observe before judging. They'll sometimes allow people to solve their own problems instead of swooping in dramatically to fix everything. That's actually a much harder kind of wisdom to write well, because it requires restraint. Imagine watching someone make a mistake you could prevent instantly, but knowing they'll become a better person if they learn the lesson themselves. Lung dragons often take that long view. It doesn't always make them popular in the moment, but over centuries, it makes them extraordinary mentors, guardians, and symbols of the patient strength that runs all through the Gentle and the Wild series. Another fascinating thing about lung dragons is how they relate to other dragons. D&D generally treats them as true dragons, every bit as ancient, intelligent, and powerful as their chromatic, metallic, and their later gem dragon cousins. They're not lesser dragons, regional dragons, or dragons that somehow don't count. They're simply a different branch of the dragon family tree. That's one of my favorite aspects of their lore because it makes the world feel bigger. If dragons evolved, or perhaps were created, with different philosophies in different parts of the world, then of course they wouldn't all think alike. Expecting every dragon to have the same outlook would be a bit like expecting every human culture to arrive at exactly the same conclusion. That's, well, history suggests otherwise. Imagine, for a moment, a meeting between an ancient gold dragon and an ancient Chiang Lung dragon. Neither of them necessarily wants to fight. Neither one is trying to prove who's stronger. Instead, you could have two immensely powerful beings sitting on opposite sides of a mountain peak, discussing justice, responsibility, and the true nature of leadership, while clouds drift lazily below them. That's the kind of scene lung dragons invite into a campaign. They create opportunity for adventures that aren't built around slaying monsters, but around understanding them. Of course, if somebody interrupts the conversation by trying to steal a priceless jade scroll, then suddenly everybody has something they can agree on, and it's probably not going to end well for the thief. One of the recurring themes you'll notice throughout nearly every lung dragon story is balance. That's a word that comes up again and again because it sits at the heart of what these dragons represent. Balance doesn't mean nothing ever changes. Rivers rise and fall, storms arrive and eventually pass. Forests grow, burn, and grow again. Seasons turn without asking anyone's permission. Lung dragons understand that change is a part of harmony, rather than the opposite. Their goal isn't freezing the world in place forever. It's allowing those natural cycles to continue without reckless interference. That's a surprisingly sophisticated idea for a monster in a fantasy role-playing game, and I think it's one of the reasons they've remained memorable despite appearing far less often than other dragon families. That philosophy also explains why lung dragons aren't automatically friendly. Sometimes people hear that they're wise, peaceful, or connected to nature, and immediately picture giant flying therapy dragons. That's maybe a little bit optimistic. They're generally compassionate, sure, but compassion doesn't always look soft. If an entire kingdom is poisoning rivers, flattening forests, or upsetting the balance of an entire region, a lung dragon may decide that decisive action is necessary. They're capable of incredible mercy, sure, but they're also perfectly willing to become the storm if that's what protecting the world requires. Gentle does not mean weak. It means choosing your strength carefully, and that's a distinction D&D doesn't always get enough credit for exploring. One thing that always amuses me is imagining what a lung dragon thinks when it meets the average adventuring party. Picture it. Here comes a heavily armored fighter carrying enough metal to sink a fishing boat, a wizard whose backpack contains 17 mysterious jars labeled probably fine, a rogue who's already checking whether the dragon's cave has unattended valuables, and a bard who's halfway through introducing themselves before anybody asked. Meanwhile, the dragon has spent the last 300 years contemplating the changing flow of a mountain stream. Those are two very different energy levels meeting in one place. Honestly, I'd pay good money just to hear the dragon's sigh. From a dungeon master's perspective, lung dragons are wonderful because they expand the kinds of stories dragons can tell. A dragon doesn't always have to be the final boss sitting on a mountain of treasure waiting for the heroes to arrive with dramatic music playing in the background. A lung dragon might be an advisor. It might be the mysterious stranger the party met 6 sessions ago without realizing it. It might quietly point adventurers toward the real threat before disappearing again into the mist. Sometimes defeating evil isn't about defeating the dragon. Sometimes it's about earning the dragon's trust. That's a very different adventure, and I think tabletop games become richer when we remember monsters can fill many different roles. What's especially interesting is that lung dragons quietly faded from the spotlight after 3rd edition. While chromatic, metallic, and eventually gem dragons continued receiving updated rules and new artwork, lung dragons never really made the leap into 5th edition's official books. That doesn't mean they disappeared from people's campaigns. Quite the opposite. Fans have continued converting them, creating homebrew versions, and talking about them because the ideas behind them remain compelling. They're one of those corners of D&D history that never quite vanished. They simply stepped out of the official publications for a while, patiently waiting for curious players to rediscover them. Somehow that feels incredibly appropriate for dragons known for patience. As miniature painters, lung dragons also offer something visually refreshing. We're so accustomed to broad wings, bulky bodies, and the classic Western silhouette that painting a long, elegant serpentine dragon immediately feels different. The flowing whiskers, the graceful curves, the elaborate horns, the almost ribbon-like movement gives you wonderful opportunities to experiment with color transitions and subtle highlights. Since I'm painting a green one today, I'm leaning into those natural tones because it feels appropriate, but there's enormous room for creativity depending on which variety you're representing. It's one of those miniatures where the pose itself tells part of the story before you've even picked up your brush. And that brings us back to why these dragons belong in the gentle and the wild. The title isn't about classifying monsters by power level. It's about the feeling they evoke. Lung dragons are unquestionably wild. They're rivers in flood, mountains standing through millennia, storms crossing oceans, and ancient forests wrapped in mist. Yet they're also gentle in the sense that they usually choose wisdom before violence, patience before anger, and guidance before domination. They remind us that incredible strength doesn't have to roar all the time. Sometimes true strength is quiet. Sometimes it's measured. Sometimes it simply watches over the world, asking for nothing more than respect in return. I also think lung dragons capture something that's easy to overlook in fantasy. Nature isn't just beautiful because it's peaceful. It's beautiful because it's alive. It changes, it surprises us, it humbles us. A calm river can become a flood. A quiet mountain can remind us how small we really are. A storm can be terrifying, while still being part of a healthy world. Lung dragons embody all those contradictions. They're serene and powerful, patient and formidable, compassionate and utterly unstoppable when the situation demands it. Those aren't opposing qualities, they're complementary ones, and that's exactly what makes them such memorable additions to D&D's dragon lore. If you've never considered adding a lung dragon to your campaign, I hope today's discussion has changed your mind. Whether you use one as a mysterious mentor, a guardian of a sacred valley, a keeper of ancient wisdom, or simply an excuse to paint an absolutely gorgeous miniature, they offer something genuinely different from the dragons most of us grew up with. Sometimes the most memorable monsters aren't memorable because they hit the hardest. They're memorable because they make us think differently about the worlds we create around the gaming table. Lung dragons have been doing exactly that for decades, and I sincerely hope that one day they soar back into official D&D books so an entirely new generation of players can discover just how remarkable they really are. That's about it for today. I'd love to hear which variety of lung dragon is your favorite, or whether you'd include one in your very own campaign. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!